Some places get famous because something happened there once. A murder house, a battlefield, a stretch of highway where a plane went down. History leaves a mark, and the mark becomes the story. Other places are different. They get famous because something keeps happening, over and over, to different people, decades apart, under different owners, with different cameras pointed at the same dirt. And somehow nobody ever gets a clean answer. If anything, the longer people look, the murkier it gets. Picture this. You buy a ranch. Not a crumbling mansion, not some abandoned asylum with broken windows. Just land. Open sky, cattle, fence posts, dust, quiet. You move your family out because you want something simpler. You're thinking about feed bills and water lines and calving season. Ordinary problems. And then one day something steps out of the brush. Looks like a wolf at first, except it's too big, too calm. It walks up near the corral like it's been there before. No snarl, no bolt for cover, nothing an actual wild animal would do. Then it goes for a calf. You hit it. Nothing. You shoot it. Nothing. You shoot it again. And now there's a chunk of flesh missing from its side. And there's no blood. None on the animal, none on the ground. I'll be honest with you, that's the kind of detail that either ruins a story completely or makes it impossible to shake. Because if that thing was real, what exactly was it? A predator that shouldn't exist? A shared hallucination? A story that has been polished by 40 years of retelling until the facts don't matter anymore? Or something wearing the shape of a wolf because that's the closest thing our brains had on file? The story goes that the animal finally let go of the calf, turned, and walked off. The rancher and his son went after it, following the prints in the mud. Deep, heavy, unmistakable, right up until the tracks hit a creek bed, and stopped. Not faded out, not scattered by water, stopped. Like something with weight and teeth took one more step and simply wasn't there anymore. That's one of the first doors into Skinwalker Ranch. It's not the last one though, not even close, because the reports coming off this piece of land in northeastern Utah don't stay in their lane. If it were just lights in the sky, fine, that's a UFO hotspot. We've got hundreds of those. If it were just mangled cattle, call it ranch folklore and move on. Shadow figures moving through a house at night, that's a haunting, plain and simple. But this ranch is all of it. At the same time, on the same land, sometimes in the same week. Lights, creatures, poltergeist activity, military money, animal deaths that look almost surgical, radiation claims, equipment that dies at exactly the wrong moment, something people call a portal, and a phenomenon whispered about more than it's talked about outright, the Hitchhiker Effect. The idea that whatever's out there doesn't necessarily stay put. So tonight isn't really about whether the ranch is haunted. That question's too small for what's actually being described. The real question is uglier. What if this isn't haunted by ghosts, but by something closer to a system? What if it's not a place where monsters show up, but a place where reality itself glitches? What if the government got involved not because it believed in ghost stories, but because whatever was out there was behaving like it was aware of the people studying it? Aware enough to know when it was being watched, aware enough to duck a camera, aware enough, some say, to follow people home. And if that's true, then maybe the conspiracy was never that people invented stories about this place. Maybe the conspiracy is that people have spent 30 years trying to tell us something's wrong with the ground out there. And we laughed because it sounded too much like something you've heard around a campfire.
Every story leaves a trace. A missing file. A witness. witness who changes their statement. A symbol repeated too many times to be coincidence. And somewhere in that noise, there's a pattern. Welcome to the Tinfoil Diaries. If you see the world through rose-colored glasses, if it makes you happy, keep them on. But this is a serious look into conspiracies, cover-ups, fringe mysteries, and the things we were told to laugh off before we were told to fear them. Each entry is traced by the host, the voice at the end of the wire, sorting fact from rumor, theory from evidence, and signal from static. Because the truth rarely arrives clean. It flickers. It distorts. It hides in plain sight. Let's follow the signal. The signal.
Welcome back to the Tinfoil Diaries, the show that doesn't just poke at the official story, it asks who benefits from us treating that story as a joke in the first place. I'm your host, and tonight's entry is The Skinwalker Ranch Conspiracy, the place where reality breaks. For a lot of people, Skinwalker Ranch is basically a paranormal theme park at this point. Cable specials, forum threads, night vision footage of somebody's flashlight beam. But strip all of that away for a second, because underneath the merch and the marketing, there's actually a piece of land, actual owners, actual investigations, actual government dollars, and actual credentialed people who walked onto that property calling themselves skeptics and walked off choosing their words very, very carefully. That's the part that gets me. Not the wolf story, not the orbs, not even the portal talk. It's the pattern. The same handful of phenomena reported year after year by people who never talk to each other, with the same maddening failure to ever get something you could put in front of a scientist and say, here. Tonight we're going to walk the fence line properly. Start with the boring explanation. The one where it's all geology and stress and coyotes and folklore. Then we'll poke at the cracks in that explanation. The mutilations, the cameras that keep dying, the scientist who wouldn't say much on the record, the Pentagon money that somehow ended up connected to a cattle ranch in Utah. And then we'll sit with the theory that keeps dragging people back to this place. That Skinwalker Ranch isn't a haunted ranch at all, it's a door. Or worse, it's a trap. So lights low, eyes on the corners, let's get into it. Before it was a brand, before the security gates and the TV crews and the endless arguments online, it was just land in the Uintah Basin. High desert, big sky, the kind of place where the horizon feels impossibly far away and somehow right on top of you at the same time. That matters more than it sounds like it should, because strange stories don't come out of nowhere. They come out of landscapes. They stick to silence, to isolation, to whatever the locals were already saying long before anyone bought a video camera. The ranch takes its name from the Skinwalker, a figure tied to Navajo tradition, usually described as a witch capable of taking animal form to do harm. That name doesn't belong to pop culture. It's not a Monster of the Week label. It carries real weight, a real taboo in the communities it comes from. And it's worth saying plainly that a lot of outsiders have flattened that history into a spooky brand name without much thought for what it actually means to the people it belongs to. The property's modern reputation starts in the mid-1990s when the Sherman family bought it. They wanted a ranch. What they got, by their own account, was something closer to a siege. Lights over the mesa, animals that moved wrong, voices with no source, footsteps outside the house when nobody was there, doors opening on their own, things vanishing and turning up somewhere else entirely. And then the cattle started dying. This is the part where the story stops sounding like folklore and starts sounding, to a lot of people, like evidence. Animals found dead, some allegedly mutilated, soft tissue gone, very little blood at the scene. Skeptics jump right to scavengers, and honestly, they're not wrong to start there. Nature isn't tidy, and it definitely doesn't care whether the aftermath looks suspicious. Coyotes, ravens, insects, heat, bloating. All of it can turn a dead animal into something that looks deliberate. Soft tissue goes first. Eyes, tongue, the parts people don't want to look at too closely. To a rancher standing over the body at dawn, that can look surgical. To someone who's seen 100 carcasses in the field, it can look completely routine. That's the first layer of the rational explanation, and it holds up. The land is harsh, ranching is brutal, animals die badly out there all the time. And when you already live inside stories about shapeshifters and cursed ground, your brain isn't starting from zero when something goes bump at 2 a.m. That's not a knock on anyone. That's just how people work. The wind becomes a voice. A coyote becomes something worse. A light on the ridge becomes a craft because the story you already know is doing some of the interpreting for you. Maybe that's the whole thing, honestly. Geology and folklore and exhaustion fusing into a legend. Maybe. Then Robert Bigelow bought the place, and the story stopped being a family's private nightmare and turned into something considerably bigger. Here's where the story starts to feel off. Haunted properties don't usually get bought by aerospace billionaires. Ranch legends don't usually attract their own private research institute. Robert Bigelow, the Las Vegas businessman behind Bigelow Aerospace, had been interested in UFOs and consciousness and unexplained phenomena for a long time before this. In the 1990s, he set up the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS, specifically to look into the kinds of reports mainstream science wouldn't touch. In 1996, he bought the ranch. Now, sit with that for a second, because the decision itself tells you something. This wasn't a rich guy grabbing a haunted house tourist trap for the novelty. This was someone with serious aerospace credentials buying a remote property already tangled up with UFO sightings, strange animals, and dead cattle, and then putting an actual research team on it. Not just some kids with a camcorder. Surveillance equipment, field investigators, documentation protocols. At least that was the plan. But according to how the NIDS years get told, the ranch did what it apparently always does. It refused to cooperate. The strangest things happened just off camera. Equipment failed at inconvenient times. Animals were spotted, then gone before anyone can confirm anything. The whole thing felt almost staged, except not random, selective. Now, I know how that sounds. It's the oldest excuse in paranormal storytelling. The ghost was here, but the tape's blank. The UFO showed up, but the footage is blurry. The creature bolted the second someone reached for a camera. We've all heard that 100 times, and we should be skeptical of it every single time. But there's a wrinkle here that makes it a little harder to wave off. The claim isn't just that cameras failed, it's that they failed at the moment something was happening, repeatedly, according to the people who were there. If that's accurate, it stops being bad luck and starts looking like a pattern, and a pattern needs an explanation. Human error, environmental interference, fraud, or the uncomfortable option, something that understands it's being watched. Believers don't think the ranch just produces phenomena. They think it responds. That it's not a location, it's a participant in a feedback loop. You watch it, and somehow it watches back. To be fair though, the NIDS years never produced the kind of proof that settles an argument. No clean creature footage, no portal on tape, nothing that forced anyone in mainstream science to admit something non-human was operating out there. That's still the skeptic's best card. After all that money, all that time, all those cameras, where's the proof? That's a fair question, and it's not going anywhere. But neither is the other one though. Why did serious people keep coming back? Let's slow way down and give the rational explanation its due, because a chunk of it holds up fine. The Uintah Basin is geologically interesting. There are hydrocarbons under it, unusual rock formations, and weather conditions that can genuinely mess with what you see at a distance. Temperature inversions bend light. Distant aircraft get distorted by terrain. None of that requires anything exotic. And then there's us. We are pattern-making animals. That's the whole reason we survived long enough to build ranches in the middle of nowhere. The ancestor who heard a noise in the dark and assumed predator outlived the one who assumed probably nothing. So when a family lives on isolated land, already wrapped in frightening folklore, their minds are primed before anything even happens. Every odd noise runs through that filter. A dead cow becomes a mutilation. A light becomes craft. A coyote becomes a monster. None of that means anyone's lying. Sincere people can have a real, frightening experience and still get the cause wrong. That's not a character flaw. That's just how brains handle fear. Our brains can do calculus and write symphonies, and they can also convince us the jacket in the chair is standing up at 3 a.m. So yes, there's a rational case here, and it's not a weak one. Mutilation claims are usually thin on forensic. Stories sharpen every time they're retold. And when there is public evidence, it tends to land in the same three buckets: blurry lights, ambiguous shapes, sensor readings nobody can contextualize. That's the real problem with Skinwalker Ranch. For all its fame, it still lives in the gap between what people swear happened and what anyone can actually prove. And that gap is exactly where the conspiracy takes root. Because believers don't just shrug and say, "We don't have proof." They say the proof is being kept from them by classification, by private ownership, by NDAs, by military interest, or by the phenomenon itself refusing to be caught. That's the hinge the whole story swings on. This next part is what separates Skinwalker Ranch from basically every other haunted property story out there. The Pentagon actually shows up in it. In 2017, reporting broke open a government-linked UFO investigation effort known as AATIP, tied to an earlier program called AAWSAP, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program. The public record on all of this is genuinely messy, full of overlapping acronyms and disputed details. But the core fact isn't in question. Real government money went towards studying anomalous aerospace phenomena, and Bigelow's company sat right in the middle of it. Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies had contracted funding tied to that program, and people connected to the Skinwalker Ranch research ended up woven into the larger UAP conversation happening in Washington. None of that proves aliens. It doesn't prove portals, wolf creatures, or shadow beings. But it does establish something worth sitting with. The people at the center of this weren't fringe bloggers telling campfire stories. They were intelligence officials, aerospace engineers, defense contractors, scientists, and sitting members of Congress. That changes the temperature of the conversation. Skeptics will point out correctly that governments waste money on all kinds of things. Believers will point out, also fairly, that nobody spends millions of federal dollars on a whim. Both of these things can be true at once, and that's exactly why this story refuses to just go away. So what was actually being studied? Advanced propulsion? Foreign drone tech? Sensor glitches? Or something closer to human perception under stress? Or all of it at once? The theory says AAWSAP was never purely about UFOs, that aerospace was cover language for something stranger, treating the paranormal as a national security question. Not ghosts as entertainment, not monsters as folklore, but anomalies as a genuine threat category. And under that theory, Skinwalker Ranch wasn't a haunted house. It was a test site. Somewhere the unknown could be observed, poked at, measured, and maybe even weaponized. Weaponized. That's the word that flips the whole story on its head. Because the moment you start imagining something that can drain batteries, dodge sensors, mess with perception, and follow a person home after exposure, you're not talking about spooky lights anymore. You're talking about a possible technology, or a force nobody named yet. And from where the Pentagon sits, that's not a curiosity. That's a problem worth funding. For what it's worth, in 2024, the Pentagon's own AARO office pushed back hard on the wilder end of UAP culture, saying flatly that it had found no verifiable evidence of extraterrestrial technology or a hidden reverse engineering program. That's a real counterweight, and it matters. The public record just doesn't back the full alien conspiracy version of events. But we found no evidence of aliens doesn't actually close the book here either. It doesn't explain the witnesses. It doesn't explain why this specific ranch became the center of gravity for this kind of story. It doesn't explain why the reports kept coming long after the Shermans sold the land. And it says absolutely nothing about the Hitchhiker Effect. Now here's the part I genuinely can't get past. A haunted ranch is one thing. It's a dot on a map you can choose not to visit. Stay on your side of the fence, keep it a strange story about strange people, and you're fine. But the Hitchhiker Effect says the fence doesn't matter. It's the claim that people who visit or investigate the ranch start experiencing things afterwards. Not at the ranch, but at home. In their bedrooms, their kitchens, ordinary houses in ordinary neighborhoods with porch lights and school buses. Shadow figures. Knocks with no source. Objects moved. Kids waking up terrified, describing something standing at the foot of the bed that was never there before the trip. The skeptical read is straightforward, and it's a good one. Trauma travels with you. Fear travels with you. If you spend days surrounded by talk of portals and entities, you come home wired, your nervous system stuck scanning for threats that aren't there. Every creak becomes evidence. Your family picks up on your unease. Your kids absorb these stories secondhand. And suddenly the house feels charged. At that point, the haunting has less to do with Utah and everything to do with expectation. That's a rational explanation, and it might even be the correct one. But the version believers tell is darker. In that version, the ranch isn't haunted the way an old house is haunted. It's contagious. More like exposure than possession. Something that attaches to attention itself. You notice it, you acknowledge it, and from that point on, you're carrying it. That's the genuinely disturbing edge of this whole conspiracy. Not aliens landing in a pasture, not rattling pipes, something that interacts with awareness directly, which sounds less like modern paranormal investigation and more like the oldest folklore on record. Don't say its name. Don't stare too long. Don't invite it in. Different cultures, different names for it, but the warning's identical every time. Attention is a door. Maybe Skinwalker Ranch is full of things that already know how to knock. So if we strip it down to its bones, what's the actual theory here? The idea is that the ranch is a thin place. A place where the wall between our world and something else has worn down. Another dimension, another frequency, a parallel reality, or just some hidden intelligence using the landscape as a camouflage. Take your pick. The mechanism barely matters to the theory. Under this reading, the lights aren't craft in any nuts and bolts sense. They're manifestations, probes, momentary windows. The mutilated cattle aren't random predation. They're sampling. The creatures people describe aren't animals at all. They're projections wearing a shape our minds can process. The poltergeist activity isn't a ghost. It's the environment being actively manipulated. Even the camera failures stop being coincidence and start looking like counter-surveillance. And the Hitchhiker Effect isn't psychological contamination, it's tagging. Tagging, like something noticed that you noticed it. I'm not telling you this proves anything. I want you to just sit with how unsettling that model actually is, though, because it means that the ranch isn't a stage where things happen. It's a participant. It's choosing when to be seen, choosing who sees it, and, maybe, choosing what evidence gets to survive. That would explain the one thing skeptics never let go of, the total absence of clean proof. In this theory, we don't get definitive evidence because definitive evidence was never going to be allowed to exist. And yes, that's dangerous logic to lean on, because a theory that explains away its own missing evidence is nearly impossible to disprove by design. But it does map uncomfortably well onto how the witnesses actually describe it. Not fully hidden, not fully visible, just enough to disturb, never quite enough to settle anything. Like someone cracking a door an inch, letting you hear breathing on the other side, and shutting it before your hand reaches the handle. Revelation, denial, contact, withdrawal. That rhythm shows up all over folklore. Fairy encounters, demon stories, trickster spirits, UFO abductions, poltergeist cases. They all share the same emotional signature. Something appears in a shape people can almost make sense of and then refuses to play by that shape's rules. A wolf that won't bleed. A craft that moves like thought instead of a machine. A shadow that has weight. A light that behaves like it's alive. Maybe those were never separate categories to begin with. Maybe they're costumes, different masks on the same unidentified thing. And maybe Skinwalker Ranch is just one of those places where the mask happens to slip. Time to cut through the fog a little, because belief comes cheap in a story built this well. Skinwalker Ranch has basically everything the human brain is wired to crave. Mystery, danger, secrecy, ancient folklore, baffled scientists, a billionaire, invisible forces, a haunted landscape. It's almost suspiciously perfect as a story. So let's hand the skeptics their strongest points one at a time. There is still no decisive public proof, not after all the cameras, the money, the decades of monitoring. Nothing has forced mainstream science to accept portals or cryptids or paranormal hitchhikers as real. Most of the claims are anecdotal, and sincere testimony still isn't the same thing as controlled data. Stories about this place have had 30 years to sharpen through repetition. Something strange happened has a way of becoming a bulletproof werewolf walked through a portal once it's been retold 100 times at 100 campfires. Government interest isn't government confirmation. A program gets funded because someone influential believed it mattered, not because the underlying phenomenon was necessarily real. And once a place becomes a media product, the incentives get messy fast. Attention has value. Mystery sells. If everything got explained tomorrow, the whole machine would stop running. None of that means that the people involved are lying. It means we owe the story some real caution. A conspiracy show that never questions its own conspiracy is just advertising dressed up as paranoia, and that's not what this is. The strongest, honest verdict might be this. Skinwalker Ranch is a case study in how folklore, ambiguous evidence, media incentives, military secrecy, and plain human psychology can fuse into something that starts generating its own gravity. People show up already expecting the impossible. They interpret whatever happens through that expectation. They leave changed, and their retelling pulls in the next round of visitors, cameras, and fear. The ranch becomes a mirror, in other words, and what it shows you depends a lot on what you brought with you. That's a solid explanation, maybe the best one available, but it still doesn't quite erase one thing: the witnesses. You can dismiss any single witness pretty easily. A family under stress, a rancher who saw something in bad light, a blurry frame of TV footage, a piece of folklore that's been through 50 retellings. Sure, fine, dismiss all of it individually. But at a certain point, Skinwalker Ranch stops being about one claim and starts being about the sheer accumulation, the number of people who say they're experiencing something firsthand, the number of professionals, actual scientists and investigators, who took the place seriously enough to build a career risk around studying it, the government-adjacent money that kept showing up decade after decade, reports that just refused to sort neatly into one box or another. None of that proves the conspiracy, but what it does is it keeps the door from swinging fully shut. And maybe that's really the power this place has. It was never going to convince everybody, and it doesn't need to. It just has to stay unresolved. Unresolved stories are the ones that survive. They slip through the cracks in whatever certainty we try to build around them. A story told at midnight. A file stamped classified. A camera that died at the exact wrong second. A kid waking up to something standing in the dark. And suddenly it isn't just land anymore. It's a question with a fence around it. What happened out there? What's still happening? And why does everyone seem so determined to either prove it once and for all or bury it for good? So, the verdict. Is Skinwalker Ranch a genuine hotspot? A portal? A quiet military research site wearing a cattle ranch disguise? A psychological contagion that spreads through fear and suggestion? Or just an ordinary piece of Utah that got famous enough to turn every strange light and dead cow into evidence? Here's the honest answer. There isn't enough public evidence to back the wildest version of this story. No confirmed portal, no confirmed intelligence from somewhere else, no confirmed monster, no alien base under the mesa, and no proof that the Hitchhiker Effect is anything beyond trauma and suggestion moving through a family like static electricity. That's the grounded conclusion, and it matters. But it's also true that this was never an ordinary ghost story. It pulled in wealthy aerospace money. It got tangled up in serious UAP research circles at the federal level. It produced decades of reports that refused to sit inside one tidy paranormal category. And the people who think something real is happening out there aren't uniformly fools or frauds. Some of them had careers on the line and reputations to protect. and plenty of them left scared, not entertained. Maybe the cleanest way to say it is this: Skinwalker Ranch isn't proof that reality is broken. It's proof that our explanations for it are still incomplete. It sits in that uncomfortable space between what people testify to and what anyone can actually measure, between folklore and defense research, between science and the parts of the world science hasn't gotten around to properly studying yet. Maybe it's a mirror. Maybe it just shows us our fear, or our hunger for a hidden truth, or how fast mystery calcifies into belief. Or maybe, and this is the part worth sitting with, there really are places on this planet where the rules are a little thinner than they should be. Places where something looks back. Places where the ground was never entirely ours to begin with. And if this ranch is one of them, the scariest possibility isn't that something came through, it's that something was always there, waiting for us to notice. Before you go to sleep tonight, think about property lines, fences, gates, locks, signs that say private land. We put those up to mark where our control begins and ends. This is mine, that's yours, stay out. But the land was there before any of that, before the deeds, before the surveys, before we ever bothered naming it. And maybe some places just don't care what we call them, don't care who signed the paperwork. Maybe they just wait, year after year, owner after owner, camera after camera, for someone to step over the line and ask the one question they shouldn't. Because once you ask, you might not be able to unask it. And once something answers, you might not get to leave it behind. Good night.
That closes this entry of the Tinfoil Diaries. But the file doesn't end just because the tape stops. Follow or subscribe so the next signal finds you. And if this entry made you pause, question, or look twice at the story you were handed, leave a 5-star rating and a short review. That is how we slip past the algorithm and keep the transmission alive. Send this to one person who still notices the details everyone else ignores. And for the deeper dive, the timelines, theories, strange documents, in-depth articles, and lies, visit thetinfoildiaries.fyi. Until next time, keep your eyes open. Keep your doubts sharp. And never forget, the pattern is always louder in the static.
If something knocks from inside the wall, don't knock back.